my life.
And hello, everyone, and welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome to Get a Grip with Coach Elex. I am your host, Coach Elex, and with me, my amazing co-host,
Stephen the Medium.
Steven the Medium. And together we make the amazing Steelex, and you're so lucky to have us both today. So, Steven, how are you? Happy Friday,
Adequate.
by the way.
Adequate.
Why?
Yes.
I heard that you weren't ready because you were just taking your curlers off, something like that.
Excuse me? I don't
What,
know where
what,
that vicious rumor came from.
yeah. Why are you adequate? What's going on?
I was one of the Facts of Life episode. One of the girls, how are you doing? Adequate. So I just figured I'd throw that in. So just saying.
Good. So what's going on with you for real?
For real, everything is going on.
Yeah.
I had a most spectacular time this past weekend, with two filmings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one on Saturday, one on Monday, the holiday. And unfortunately, I mean, I hate doing this because I'm mentioning it, but I can't really mention much of anything. But it was something that just sporadically happened, and I love when spirit just sets these opportunities in front of you and things work out. And I filmed this amazing episode for this series that will be coming out. I'm not really sure yet when, but I am really, really excited because, well, first of all, you got to come. You were part of watching everything, Elix, which I loved. And secondly, from the producer / director to everyone else that was on his team were amazing. They were just the nicest people, and just that genuineness that if you're lucky to find, it's really good.
Yeah, and not only that, I think it's worth mentioning that the director of we both had to sign non-disclosures because I'm going with Steven, so he reached out to me, and then he gave me specific instructions about where I needed to go, and Steven couldn't know, and and of course I'm taking that very seriously, and Steven, it's like wondering, what do we do, where do I go, and you were very concerned there up until the very last minute, Steven, weren't you?
Well, I mean, you're forgetting to mention that I was also blindfolded. So, that was like 5 minutes before we got to the location. You had to blindfold me. So, yeah, I mean, listen, if you've ever experienced being like blindfolded in a car in the passenger seat, then the car door, you can tell, opens up after you stop, and someone's just grabbing your hand, and two people are grabbing you and telling you to walk and lift. There's a step, and you hear people in the background. And how many times I kept saying, "Elix, are you there? Elix, are you there?"
Constantly. But also, I mean, the funniest thing, Steven, was that you, like a kid, trying to figure out where we're going, and you were asking your spirit guides to tell you, and nobody was telling you. Everyone was, shouting you out because it was important for you not to know. And
Yeah.
But I knew all along, so I got a big kick because you were convinced at some point that this was not real. This is not happening because you know nothing about it. I'm like, and I waited till the very last minute to let you know exactly where we were going. So,
Well, you were in the kitchen with Ava, with cousin Evita Milagros, right? And the two of you
yes,
were there, and I was upstairs, and I am meditating, and I'm checking in, and I'm getting nothing, which is not the normal for me. So I came downstairs, right? I'm not exaggerating. I came downstairs and
no,
said, I'm not sure about this whole thing. I'm not sure it's legit. I don't know what's going on because I can't feel anything, and something's wrong. And then Elix was like, I know where we're going. I've already spoken to the producer. I'm like, what? and then I realized that Spirit was blocking me, so I couldn't get anything.
For a good reason.
Yeah, well, exactly,
Yeah.
because that was the nature of this filming, right? So it was,
Yeah.
but the experience was amazing. Then Saturday, you and I did something that is more closer to us, that we have more of a handle on, and that was amazing, also.
Yes, I think that's our best film yet.
Yes.
I think so. I can't wait to see the edited version, and so that's exciting. That brings me to next week. Not because let me see. When we leaving Saturday, right? So
Well,
we will have
yeah.
a show next Friday. So right after our next show Friday, we are heading to LA. And then we're gonna spend some time in Palm Springs celebrating Steven's birthday. But LA, it's very exciting news, isn't it, Steven?
Yes, yes. I'm a little rattled. I didn't think you were doing a show next Friday
I
because
am.
we're leaving Friday.
Uh, yeah, we're leaving Friday afternoon, aren't we?
Yeah, but I have a. Well, here's
Or
the deal. We're leaving Saturday on the plane, but Friday night I have a group reading, so there's a
yeah,
lot going on.
there's
So
a lot going on. But there was
yes,
a lot going on last weekend, and we got through it, and we did extraordinarily well. And I'm
yes, sir.
super happy that we were able to do that.
Yes,
So, but also, Stephen, I mean, this is worth saying again. You also have an amazing show in New York City for the first time.
yes, on July 30th. Everything is on my website, and I know it's been being advertised by the wonderful Amanda, who she's amazing. She really is. So you can go to my website, or the advertisements will bring you right to the Green Room 42 where the tickets are being sold. And July 30th is a Sunday. It's at 1 p.m. And I am so excited about doing this.
Yeah, and Green Room 42 is an incredible venue
Yes.
in New York City where a lot of big stars have gone to or
Yes.
been. So the fact that you've been able to have that venue book you for a gig in New York City, that's incredible. So anyone that lives in New York City, in the surrounding areas, that have been wanting to see Stephen the Medium, this is your opportunity to get to NYC and get to see Stephen live. Nothing like it. And I can tell you nothing like it because going back to the filming this weekend, that's all I kept hearing. I mean, the crew were blown away by you, Stephen. Blown away by you.
Wow,
It was amazing.
That's very nice to hear, and I cannot wait to actually see the episode. I really cannot wait. I think it's going to be spectacular. And by the way, Sunday I have an event in Acushnet, which I'm not really sure how many tickets are left, but you can check my website out too because you can pay either Venmo or you could purchase tickets at the door. But it's at the Off Broadway School of Dance on Main Street in Acushnet, and the great thing is that a portion of the funds are going to the dancers there for costumes or competitions, and that's going to be a lot of fun.
I think so.
And it's limited. It's also limited too. So it's not a huge group. So I think it's limited to 50. I think so. If you're around and interested on a Sunday afternoon at 4 to 6, you definitely should come see me. You'll get to see Elix, and also you get to see a whisper in a note, how that works too.
Wait a minute. They get to see me? How do you know I'm coming? That was not in the plan. There's a fee to take me on the road, Stephen. You do realize that, right? All right, Mark, moving right along. Today, Stephen, I wanted to continue the conversation that we've been having for the last 2 weeks. But today I wanted to focus on vulnerability because vulnerability really is the power of meaningful human experiences. And I also believe that vulnerability is the core, the heart, the center of what it means to embrace um, a meaningful life. Whatever that means to you. So I think that's important, and I've experienced, of course, over the last several months, I've experienced, the need to be vulnerable, and how the reward of being willing to step into that space of uncertainty, not knowing, sometimes fear, but the reward, but what you get in return. So I'm very excited about having this conversation today, because I think a lot of people walk away from vulnerability. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you say, Stephen?
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, simply because there's this fear that being vulnerable puts you at risk, and of course, that's part of the neuroscience of our brains. Our brain, part of our brain, the reptilian brain, is designed to protect us from perceived fear, and vulnerability is perceived by that brain as a risk. If you put yourself in that space, you are gonna get hurt. If you put yourself in that space, excuse me, you are going to experience being upset, or being sad, or being disappointed, or whatever that is. And so that's why it really is part of the human behavior to avoid being vulnerable. But just like anything else, that is something that we need to practice. It's a mechanism that we're not necessarily comfortable with, but the more we practice vulnerability, the better we get at it, and the more that it opens up for us. Vulnerability opens opportunity, whether it's in business, whether it's personal, in relationship. There's a lot of people who fail at relationships, Stephen, because they're unwilling to be vulnerable. And that being vulnerable is a necessary part of a relationship. Frankly, it's a necessary part of our human experience, as I said earlier. So that's what we're going to talk about today, Stephen. And of course, I'm always looking to hear your perspective from the spiritual side. So I'm excited to engage in this conversation. But right now, I'm excited because it's time for a commercial break. You like that, Stephen? And
That was adequate.
it's a commercial break, and it's necessary, but we'll be right back. And most importantly, this is a conversation that is open to all of us. So if you want to join the conversation, if you have something that you want to share with us, Stephen and I, you're welcome to call 508-222-1320. But for now, we're going to take a commercial break, and we'll be right back. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Get a Grip with Coach Elix. I'm your host, Coach Elix. With me, my amazing co-host,
Attorney and medium Stephen F. Masick.
Stephen the Medium, is in the house. And today we are continuing our conversation, the conversation we've had the past 3 weeks, actually. But today we're going to focus on vulnerability and the power of being vulnerable. And I think that's an incredible conversation to be had because, our lives, Stephen, are often unpredictable. We make plans. In some cases, these plans do not go as we hoped, and that happens quite frequently. And we are exposed to a state of harm and attack emotionally and physically. Like I said earlier before, oftentimes, that leads to that primitive brain to put us in that state of fight, flee, protect, and defend. And it can be said that, the state, when you feel emotionally and physically attacked, could be, that state of being vulnerable. And I think today conversation is really about understanding, vulnerability and the measures that we can take to cope and the benefits of this state in our lives. Now, Brené Brown, who I'm sure many of you know about, says that vulnerability is consciously choosing to hide your emotions and desires from others. Think about that. Consciously choosing to hide your emotions and desires from others. Vulnerability is the state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked, harmed, or hurt physically and emotionally. So that is how she defines vulnerability, but there's a lot of power in being vulnerable. It doesn't sound like it's a good thing, right? Because who would want to experience that state of being attacked, harmed, or hurt, whether it's physically or emotionally? But there is real, genuine power, because when you experience real vulnerability, genuine vulnerability, that represents a deep and subtle form of strength that you can use to thrive and live a fulfilling life. And that is why we're talking about vulnerability today. So Stephen, in the past few weeks, we've touched about being vulnerable. We've never done a deeper dive, and I want to do that today. But what is your understanding of being vulnerable, Stephen?
When I hear the word vulnerable, I automatically always attach it and feel like its partner is shame. And that's coming from my personal experience.
Yes.
It's one of the I think it's one of the most difficult things to do, or to get to being vulnerable, because it's almost like if you were like staring straight ahead, you'd have shame and then vulnerable behind shame, but you got to get through shame to get to vulnerable, or anything else that you may want to insert. Mine is shame, but anything else, whether it's embarrassment or fear, whatever the case may be, maybe it's all of them. I know for me it was, but shame was the biggest deal. And to get to being vulnerable, you've got to get through shame, and it's very, very, very hard for many, many individuals, because it's like, as you mentioned, it's a protection. You're in protection mode, that I'm not going to become vulnerable, because if I do, then I'm going to get hurt, or I'm going to be made fun of, or somewhere down the road someone's going to use it on me, or it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, that actually, Stephen, I never connected vulnerability with shame, but that makes perfect sense. And as I'm listening to you, then that allows me to connect, because shame also comes from those old stories, from previous life experiences, and the stories that we created long ago, and over the years, we don't really relate to them as stories. We relate to them as that's our reality, right? And that's where a lot of the shame comes from. And of course, that shame leads to wanting to protect ourselves. And that shame leads to not avoiding a really important part of our life, which is being vulnerable. Would you agree with that?
Yes, very much so.
So, and there are, by the way, today, this conversation is focused on personal vulnerability, again, defined as the state of emotional exposure that comes with a certain degree of uncertainty. But there are other kinds of vulnerability. For example, there's the physical vulnerability, and you could say that an example of that is, any area that is located in geographic proximity to a source of a potential disaster like a hurricane, fire, flooding, earthquakes, etc. So there's a physical vulnerability that comes with that. There's also the political vulnerability, in that comes, that may be related to issues associated with social justice, for example, LGBTQ, immigration, racial um, uh, conflicts, productive rights. You and I, Stephen, there have been many times when we talk about, marriage equality, where that conversation at least makes me very vulnerable. The uncertainty of what may happen, to that right for you and I.
Right.
Social vulnerability, it's another form of vulnerability, often associated with, poor countries, communities, or, countries that experience racial conflict. There's the economic vulnerability, and that's actually very similar to the one to the social vulnerability, more associated with poor communities or communities that do not have the same economic resources as others. There's also the environmental vulnerability. That's one that we've been listening to quite often, Stephen, because climate change, it's really leading to a lot of concern about the environment and how vulnerable our environment is. Um, Academic vulnerability, access to higher education, as an example. And this word I can't pronounce well, Stephen, so maybe you can help me with this, but attitudinal vulnerability. Uh,
I
you
don't
know,
have it in front of me, so
so it has to do with our own attitude, right? You know, it's associated. This is associated with feeling victimized, feeling helpless, feeling pessimism, and really holding on to those attitudes. So those are again. There's a lot of kinds of or types of vulnerability. And by the way, oftentimes experiencing one of all those other kinds of vulnerability will or may lead to that personal vulnerability. Like, for example, like I said earlier, when we're talking about that political vulnerability related to marriage equality for you and I, that can certainly lead to personal vulnerability, like feeling scared, like, oh my god, what is going to happen, and that can affect our personal way of interacting with others. What do you think, Stephen? What are you hearing here so far?
oh, I think a lot of people wouldn't really think about how many kinds of vulnerability there would be when you go through like the political and social and economic. I don't think people sort of decipher it like that, and it's I think it's very valuable for people to understand that something like the physical vulnerability, when you talk about like hurricanes or fires or something like that, that what they're feeling or going through is something that can be labeled, or maybe just have a better understanding of it so that they would be able to deal with it in a better fashion.
Yeah, yeah. And so the question is, so why is it that it's important that we embrace vulnerability in our lives, and specifically personal vulnerability, right? That state of feeling, feeling some vulnerable, feeling, I don't know, the word is escaping me right now, but like when you're consciously choosing to hide something, from others because you feel exposed, um, because you may be harmed, you may be attacked, you may be physically and emotionally hurt. So, like, why is it important that we embrace vulnerability? Like, from my perspective, I believe that embracing vulnerability actually provides us with greater strengths. It actually makes us stronger, not weaker. And it is a way of embracing our own power, not give away our power, which makes us victim, which, by the way, puts us in a more vulnerable state. It also helps us, of course, it helps us build stronger and better relationships. I talked earlier about, relationships. In relationships, you need to learn to be vulnerable. You and you often, how many times, Stephen, believe it or not, I'm a coach. I coach people to, to be their, to live their best lives, to be their best selves. But I oftentimes, struggle with being vulnerable, obviously because of my own, life experiences, my, the things that in the past got me really hurt, and you help me a lot of the times deal with that. You help me overcome that fear. You are constantly reminding me, you need to share with me. You need to tell me how you feel. Because for me, when I go back to experiences where I got hurt or I was, I felt a sense of loss and a loss of power, I go back to that place where I'd rather not say anything, right? Because it keeps me safer. So in relationships, being vulnerable, it's important. So if you embrace vulnerability, you are bound to strengthen your relationship with yourself, your relationship with your family, and your relationship with your loved ones, among others. And also, of course, it improves, your your self acceptance and the view of your self view, the view of how you see yourself. So those are three reasons why I believe it's important to embrace vulnerability. Stephen, we do have to take a break, but when we come back, I'm really curious to hear your perspective as to why you think it's important for us to embrace vulnerability, and also get your perspective from a spiritual place. Why is vulnerability important?
Oh,
Deal?
goody. Oh,
Awesome.
goody.
So we are going to take another commercial break, and we'll be right back. If you want to call, 508-222-1320. Lines are always open for your feedback and engaging in our conversation. We'll be right back. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Get a Grip with Coach Helix. I'm your host, Coach Helix, with me, my wonderful co host,
Stephen, the medium.
Stephen the Medium. And today you get Steelex for the next hour. And we're talking about vulnerability, really continuing the conversation we've started several weeks ago. And but today we're honing in on the power of being vulnerable. And before we took a break, I talked about why I feel vulnerability is important in our lives. And I am curious to hear your perspective, Stephen, both from your personal perspective and from a spiritual perspective. Why do you think vulnerability is important?
Well, coming from my personal experience, which, if you listen to through the static or this show, you probably have heard this, or my lives, is that I lost my dad. My dad took his life when I was 8 years old. And not that that wasn't bad enough, but I do remember, my mom would tell everybody, and so I don't know if she specifically told us to say this, but we went by her lead, that what happened to your father, what happened to your husband? He had a heart attack. That was it. That was a clear case of my mom not being vulnerable and hiding things, and that what people would think and what people would say and all of that kind of stuff. So, for many, many years, I had that with me, and because of my father taking his life, I had a lot of things to sort of grapple with, and even though they're much, much better, I still do, right? That's where the shame piece comes in. But I do know from my experience in dealing with and working with spirit, is that first and foremost, that if you're not allowing yourself to be vulnerable, it really just means that you're letting external things control you. And I don't mean that everyone should be vulnerable every step of the way. I don't mean that at all. Like, for instance, never telling people and not being open and vocal about my dad taking his life. So when I didn't tell people that, it's because, of course, I was concerned about what others would think. So that's not internal, that's external, right? I'm more concerned about what people would think, and then they would turn to me and what people would think of me. Oh my God, his dad, took his life. How does he feel? I mean, I wonder if he did that because of his son, and all of this kind of stuff. So, and it's like having a car, and having a particular car that needs like a specific fuel, like diesel or something, and you're getting regular unleaded. So you get in the car and you keep going on a road trip. Eventually you're going to have issues and you're going to have problems, so you're going to have to keep stopping. That would be sort of like an analogy of someone's life who is not open to being vulnerable, because it's always going to be their life is always going to be interrupted with things. Mm-hmm. Versus if you are open and vulnerable, and you understand that you're deserving, that you have the right to have this free and clear mind, and you deserve to be loved, and it all starts with the internal structure. Then you get the right gasoline and you just fly down your path, hitting every single opportunity, and just being in such a great place. And I know I'm talking a lot, but I will tell you something very, very quickly. When I was dealing with a counselor about shame and how it's attached to vulnerability, she did a meditation with me, and she said, I want you to, in your third eye, envision what shame looks like. And again, I'm saying this because it's attached to vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't know what was going to happen, so we did it together, and it was via Zoom. And somehow, some way, my third mind or third eye, just like I could see the shame as like a sort of like a rubber mat. It was an orange rubber mat. I don't know why it was orange, but it was. And I just found myself in the meditation trying to get anything I could to damage it. I was kicking it, I was punching it, I was looking for a knife to stab it. I was trying to do everything I could, because it just represented, the shame represented such an evil part of my life, like something that affected me my entire life. And I did anything and everything to dismantle it and pull it apart and make it go away and never come near Stephen again. So then when we were done, I was explaining that to my therapist, and my therapist came back in a very wonderful way, said that you that's a cycle. That's what you've been doing your entire life. You can't dismiss, you can't remove yourself from shame. Shame has a purpose in some aspects of your life. So shame, I need shame so I don't walk out, to the supermarket naked and not have any shame, like, hey, hello, I want deli meat with, everything else just hanging out, right? I mean, that's probably a bad comparison and analogy, but you need that. And the trick was to become friends with shame. And when I did that and started understanding that, that's when I started becoming more vulnerable and opening it up to there's no more shame. There's and it's okay. It's actually I'm getting so much more than I ever realized I would being vulnerable. Being not vulnerable. It was a crazy meditation, a crazy experiment, but when I stepped into being vulnerable, everything changed. It was like I was Steven. I was the soul of Steven, and everything else was so much better, Elix.
Yeah. And again, that highlights, how shame is connected with our ability to be, or willingness perhaps, to be vulnerable. And I tell you, Stephen, I'm sure many of our listeners can really relate to what you share, because in many ways, part of the human experience, we, again, going back to those stories, those narratives, a lot of that, they're surrounded by shame. They're surrounded by shame. So I love that you're giving people insight in how to really embrace perhaps the shame, or be transparent, or even find a safe space to feel, that emotion that comes with shame. There's many other things that you could do. To experience vulnerability, it may be practice at taking chances that might lead to rejection, or doing something even if you're not sure how it's going to end up, and even if you fail, that's a way of practicing being vulnerable. Talking about mistakes, being transparent about things that you've done that haven't worked out, sharing personal information that you normally may keep private to yourself. Believe it or not, reconnecting with someone you've fallen out with is a way to express vulnerability. And by the way, one way that you've helped me at expressing vulnerability also, Stephen, is being transparent with others. Not holding back, being willing to say something, even if I feel it won't be received well on the other side. Because what was happening in the past is I wasn't saying anything, right? And then I was holding on to not saying anything, which sort of leads to that resentment when you resist something, and then you recognize that you're resisting saying something. It leads to resentment, and that feeds into not wanting to be vulnerable. And then of course being honest about what you need in relationship, again, whether they're personal relationships, work relationships, and and being willing to create very clear boundaries. That's another way. I mean, people avoid vulnerability, and because they don't want to create boundaries, because they're afraid that if they create a boundary, it will lead to, especially in the workplace, for example, if you create a boundary, do not talk to me this way, it will lead to them getting fired. But not doing so will lead to far, far worse. What else, Stephen? What do you think?
It's interesting as you just say that, and maybe others that are listening to this can maybe understand this, that it also can be aspects of your life that you refuse to be vulnerable, and then there's also aspects because of this the part of you that refuses to be vulnerable makes you even more vulnerable in other aspects of your life.
No
Because
question.
when you just talked about, saying, maybe in the workplace, as believe me, the shame has been with me my entire life, in hiding things, and in just, so many things, hiding so many things before going through therapy and all this kind of stuff. But I think because of the section that I wouldn't be vulnerable, and the section of shame would actually also create sort of openings or opportunities for me to be vulnerable, because in many jobs I was the one to say, listen, I don't care who else you talk to like that, do not talk to me like that. And it's been something that, I know, Elix, you have seen, in I have very clear boundaries that I will help you whatever I can, but I also have clear boundaries that I also need to be respected. And I think the only way I was able to say stuff like that is because of, in a very odd way, because of the section of me that wouldn't be vulnerable. However, even with that said, yes, it may have helped me in different, and it definitely has helped me in different positions and jobs and whatnot. But if you look at the bigger picture, still having that ball of not being vulnerable is just, it eats away at parts of your life. And you may have these temporary successes in great things, but they're not long lived. And it's just something that you've got to smash open that vulnerability ball, and just again sit with it, as I mentioned with the shame.
Well, that's something that when I'm coaching my clients, I talk about all the time. There's consequences in everything that we do, including the things that we don't do. There's the good, there's the bad, there's the neutral, but there's always a consequence. So what you're pointing out to Stephen is, look, sometimes humans avoid being vulnerable because of the consequence of, if I am vulnerable, it may lead to X, right? So they avoid it. But what you're speaking to, Stephen, is when you avoid certain things, that actually leads to other consequences. And maybe those other consequences are far greater than confronting something. Like they may be far greater. If we stick to the job example, yeah, you may avoid setting a clear boundary with a boss or a colleague that is being disrespectful, because you feel that if you're vulnerable, it will lead to you getting fired. The problem with embracing that way of being is that may lead to a far worse consequence, which is having somebody that disrespects you time and time and time again. And that's one thing that I've learned from you, Stephen. I've learned to be willing to draw the line, to be willing to say, no, actually, there's the line, and the moment you cross that, it's a deal breaker, and I'm unwilling to negotiate differently. There's no negotiation when it comes to that. So that's a great point. Of course, we do have to take another commercial break, Stephen, but when we come back, I want to hear your perspective in terms of how vulnerability affects men versus women, and talk more about why being vulnerable really matters. We'll be right back. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Get a Grip with Coach Helix. I'm your host, Coach Helix. With me, my wonderful co host,
Stephen the Medium.
Stephen the Medium's in the house. And we're talking about vulnerability and why embracing vulnerability is a very powerful thing for our human experience. And of course, Stephen, when I hear you talk about being vulnerable and connected to shame, the first thing that comes to mind is that as men, we've been conditioned to not be vulnerable from very early on. We've been told that men don't cry. We've been told that men don't are not supposed to uh, express feelings. That you got to be strong. That you got to be the one in charge, and all of that is a way to condition someone to not be vulnerable. So, what what is something, Stephen, that you think we need to do or we can do to change that, or to perhaps teach our young children differently?
Well, you know what? Between, as you mentioned before, break helix between men and women. I'm not an expert in how each of the sexes get hit with vulnerability. I mean, I know what you just said is of course true, and how guys grow up. But you also talked about stories and what we pick up. That's the essence of what's going on in not being vulnerable. Is you pick up stories just like you talked about with guys, that they're told by their parents or father or whomever, not to show emotions. The where you have to start with this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, is internally. And you have to be at peace in accepting and understanding of who you are in this lifetime, and also an understanding of that who you are in this lifetime is going to keep changing, and the people that are the most successful are the people that get that and change with it. And one of the things I say when I teach a course, I don't know which course it is that you don't get what, like, if someone says something about what they want, and I always say it's not really what you want. It's really who you are determines what you're going to get and where you're going to be, and in being in the presence. And because we keep changing, and the more you get in tuned with your soul, and again, who you are and what you deserve, and that confidence, and knowing that you've been placed on this earth for a unbelievable magical reason, then everything starts building from that. And I think then you're more apt to be vulnerable. Like, and again, males and females, when they are vulnerable, I'm sure there's different avenues in cases, because we're not equal. And I mean just that in the sense of guys and women are different. I don't mean it in the sense of equality. I just mean we're different in that, like you said, Alex, a lot of women don't get the don't be emotional, but guys do. So it's turning internally is the best way you can help yourself.
But what is one way? Again, I get what you're saying, but if we're being conditioned, right, from early on, from from being children, for example, young boys, you don't cry. Boys don't cry. Women, have been conditioned, and it's funny because you and I, we listened to that very old show, the Lucy Ball podcast, and we could hear a lot of those very old beliefs in those conversations. Women, you're not supposed to be too confident, because then you're going to be perceived as this or that. What's a tangible way of shifting that belief, if that's what if that is all that we know, that's all we've been taught from early on?
Yeah, it's amazing that you bring up Let's Talk to Lucy, because even Lucy mentions about her second marriage that she needed the guy to be dominant, and you and I listened to it like, what, like, and that was back in the '60s, right? So one
Yeah.
thing that I also teach in my course, which I think from the feedback I get from the students is pretty great, is questioning the beliefs, questioning your life. And I do that example, or that sort of, I pose it as an experiment, is to to sit, meditate, and pull out of yourself, like in your third eye, see your actual, your soul pulling out of yourself. So if you're sitting in a chair, you can, in your third eye, see, like you pull yourself out from the body, and you can see your body, the back of your body, from where you are. And that's the magic place that you can start questioning in what are your beliefs? Like, are they serving you? Like, where did you pick up these beliefs? Just looking at, I shouldn't be emotional as a guy. Why? What is gonna, like go through the scenario? If I am, what's gonna happen? Is not being emotional. Like if I look at the branches of that, like how many consequences or negative things affect me because of just that one belief. So I think you don't have to necessarily, because some people are not the greatest with getting in your third eye. I just think one way to do this is to really take inventory of your life, sit back, take a couple of deep breaths, and just start thinking of how you live. Maybe even use a day, use the day that just happened, and sort of try to look for things that your behavior is like, it happens because of a belief. And the more curious you get, and the more questioning you get, or you start bringing up questions, I think you start slicing at it, and it's better.
I agree. I think that's a wonderful, tangible way to shift or to practice being vulnerable. And what I would say from my perspective, if you're struggling with vulnerability, if you're one of those individuals who grew up hearing you shouldn't be, emotional, or you shouldn't do that, or men don't do this, or women don't do that, I would say watch your language. Really pay attention to what you're saying and how you're speaking it. Because, for example, when somebody says to me, and I do a lot of this work with my own clients, when somebody says to me, I'm not emotional, I say, why? Just like you did, Stephen, why? Where does that come from? Says who? Are you like a non-emotional blood type? If you go to a lab and we get you tested, would it come back as non-emotional? Because the reality is, the answer to that would be ridiculous, right?
Right.
But that's how we relate. We relate to those narratives as if those are the truths, and oftentimes those truths are the ones that really put a lid on what's possible in our lives. So that said, Stephen, why, just to end today's show, why do you feel vulnerability is a strength?
Because it opens up the opportunities that are completely connected to why you're here, what you're supposed to learn, your passion, your purpose. And not being vulnerable is a block in everything I just mentioned. And when I talk about a block, I just mean even getting to your goals and your dreams, and what you want in this life.
Fabulous. And my answer is, being vulnerable is a strength because it allows you to live your best and most authentic life. So you get to choose. If that's what you want, then you can be choosing not being vulnerable, because they don't exist in the same space. You gotta be vulnerable and wanting to your best life, or you not be that, but you're not gonna be living your best life.
I love
that's what I'd say. That's my final advice. And in Puerto Rico, well, actually, it's in Latin America. There's a show. It's a fake court show, and at the end, the fake judge says, "Case closed, caso cerrado." Boom. I'm just closing my show with "case closed." Boom. Caso cerrado.
What, are you using my legal stuff now?
Final word. I'm just copying the Latin America show. Just saying, my Latin America people will know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, Stephen, if people want to get a hold of you, where would they find you?
They would find me under Stephen the Medium.
Beautiful.
Anywhere. Website, social media. Just type in Stephen the Medium, and you can check out all the events and everything that's coming up.
Beautiful. And you can find me at Coach Helix. If you don't follow me, please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, anywhere in social media.
Sure.
And have a wonderful weekend, everyone. It looks like a beautiful, beautiful weekend.
Yes, it's going to be cold.
And Stephen is very happy about that. We'll see everyone next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.